We now have the pleasure of being joined. I think we can call him a recurring guest. It's Brendan Marks of The Athletic. He covers the ACC, specifically Duke and North Carolina for The Athletic. Brendan, how are you on this Tuesday afternoon?
I'm doing well, thanks. I appreciate you guys having me.
Of course, it's a pleasure to get you back on the show. Looking at the ACC as a whole to start things off, it's been an interesting year so far. Still very early in the conference slate. Each team just having played a few games to this point. There have been some good matchups. Carolina, Clemson last weekend. Some other games around the conference. What have you made of the ACC so far?
Yeah, I don't think that the ACC, is having one of its traditional, 2019 three number one seeds sort of year, but I also don't think it's necessarily a bad year. Like, if we're being honest, this is just kind of what the ACC has become. It's a league that has, maybe one or two legitimate contenders, and then a couple of teams that are in that good, next tier. And then you've got a lot of middling teams who are all trying to claw their way into the NCAA tournament. So, I've been really impressed, I think, by North Carolina this season. I think they're, proving they're the team to beat so far. You've still got a couple of bottom feeders. Thanks Louisville, thanks Notre Dame. And then, sort of the rest of everybody else, I think, for one reason or another, you could slot into that meaty middle.
You talk about the expectations, and you mentioned the 2019 year. North Carolina, Duke, Miami, Clemson all have been ranked at points this year. What are your expectations for the ACC kind of as a whole going forward in terms of basketball? Is it more of that kind of more middle tier conference, especially when kind of you add on those teams in the near future?
Yeah, I don't think the ACC has finished better than fifth in Ken Palm's conference rating since 2019, I believe. Um, kind of wild how that happens, but you lose as many Hall of Fame coaches and as many, longtime people as you have, and that's what happens. And like, I think the ACC right now has seven coaches who are in their first 3 years at their program. You do still have a couple of those holdovers. You've got the Jim Laraneigas and the Leonard Hamiltons, and I guess Brad Brownell kind of falls in that category by now. But it's you would like to think that the ACC could get back to what it was, but especially with the addition of the teams who are coming in next year, I don't know that any of Cal or Stanford, although Stanford has had a couple of impressive wins so far this season, and SMU, I don't know that they're necessarily going to enhance the product, to use the corporate speak, but like, listen, the ACC is always going to have some of those blue bloods. It's always going to have teams that are nationally relevant. And like you said, be it Miami, Clemson this year, Virginia obviously had its stay, Syracuse, Wake Forest, even. There's the potential still in this league to rise up and to be a contender. But, I think the ACC's days of being an undisputed top three league are unfortunately probably a little bit in the past.
Well, maybe the chances are a bit higher now that the Pac-12 will cease to exist after this season. That it could creep back up in the rankings. When you look at teams within the conference, it was pretty clear before the season. You had your top four of Carolina, Duke, Miami, Virginia, and then Clemson has kind of come out and cemented itself as one of these upper echelon teams. Aside from the Tigers, because I think they're pretty obvious answer. Are there any teams that have caught your eye in terms of over or underperforming, even though a lot of them have been within the middle of the conference?
Yeah, I think at different levels of overachieving, there have been a couple. Like, I think Wake Forest is still undefeated since it's brought Efton Reed back and gotten him eligible. And, Steve Forbes has been saying, even going back to October, like, if we have Efton Reed, we're a tournament team. And if we don't, we're not. So far, that has borne out. Like, so I've been pleasantly surprised by Wake Forest in that regard. Listen, Georgia Tech is not having a banner season by any means, but they also haven't been, I thought they might be roadkill this year. So I've been, surprised positively that way. And, I think Syracuse is one of those teams that you loop in there. Like, Syracuse doesn't have one of those pull the rug out from under you. Your season is over in December because you've got this abysmal sub 200 loss. Like, Syracuse has mostly beaten the teams that you thought it would, and it's lost to the teams that you thought it would. So, I know that's probably not the standard of success that folks in Syracuse want to be held to. But I would say, all three of those teams for different levels have been better than I might have thought they would have been before the season.
One of the reasons that some of these teams are towards the top of the conference is they're led by budding stars that could eventually, obviously, go to the NBA. Looking at the conference as a whole, who are kind of the guys that you're eyeing for player of the year and guys that could get drafted in the first round come the NBA draft in June?
Yeah, well, I think those are two different conversations. Because the guy who I would say is probably in the front runner spot for player of the year in the conference is RJ Davis at North Carolina. He had 8 straight games of 20+ points. He looks not just like a guy who could win, conference honors, but looks like a potential All-American. I mean, he's been that effective as a scorer. It's kind of wild how both he and Caleb Love are having these banner seasons now that they're finally split apart. But I'll leave my commentary there at that. As far as, draft pick wise, I think obviously that conversation starts with Kyle Filipowski at Duke. He's a guy looks like, again, a potential All-American candidate, was preseason player of the year for a good reason. I think is still very much in that conversation. Hasn't necessarily been as productive from the perimeter, I think, as NBA scouts were hoping to see, but has been much better as a passer, has been much better defensively. Has been in a funk at times this season, but still has been, the driving force for Duke so far this year. And then, you start talking about a couple of other guys around the league who maybe are not in that lottery conversation. I don't think Tyrese Proctor has really done himself a whole bunch of favors in the draft conversation, some of that through injury, some of that through inefficiency. Jared McCain is a guy who doesn't have the best measurables in the world, but man, can he shoot that thing. And if you have an NBA skill, it tends to translate, and NBA teams tend to value that. So, I'd say he's a guy who's probably, looking at being a late first rounder as of right now. I don't know if it'll be this year or next year, but, Wooga Poplar is a really intriguing name down at Miami. PJ Hall at Clemson is a guy probably not first round just because of his age, but, as an inside out big man, somebody who can do a little bit of everything, in the second round there, I think he could be an option. So there's a lot of guys around the league. I mean, Judah Mintz, I don't know what the appetite is for, a small 2 guard who can't shoot the ball, who has some defensive liabilities, but like, again, there's a lot more second round conversation starters in the ACC than there are slam dunk first rounders. I would probably cap that list at just Filipowski and McCain right now.
It's funny you mentioned we did a show last week where we each gave 3 takes about where Syracuse was here, and one of mine was I don't think Jude is getting drafted based on like he's small, he shoots the ball and doesn't make it a lot. The most damning number is not only has he had trouble to shoot it from the outside, his 2 point percentage on non-layups is under 25%. And that number really stood out to me as like, ooh, that is not good, especially if you're not hitting it from 3 point range. PJ Hall has been so interesting to me. And Clemson just played a really tight game, down at home against Carolina. And those have been 2 of the top teams in the conference this year. Do you see, Carolina made the national title game, I would say rather unexpectedly 2 years ago. And Clemson was a team that's getting close to the top 10. Carolina is in the top 10. How many, what is the ceiling for this league? Is Carolina a legit Final Four team? Could Clemson be a second weekend team? Duke a second weekend team? What do you see as kind of the ceiling for the league this year?
Yeah, I think that I'll put it this way. I would not want to play Duke or North Carolina in the NCAA tournament. North Carolina, I think, in 2 of the 3 seasons that Hubert Davis has been head coach, the offense has been, top 10, top 20-ish right now. I think it's 11th in adjusted efficiency, while we're recording. That is scary. North Carolina has a lot of ways it can beat you. It can shoot 3. Obviously, Armando Bacot hasn't been the Armando Bacot who, was a borderline All-American 2 years ago. But he just shut down PJ Hall, completely dominated that game on the interior, I think, especially in the second half. And is a guy who's still incredibly effective. Like Harrison Ingram can do a little bit of everything. So, North Carolina, and again, they're doing this with Cormac Ryan, who they brought in to be sort of the senior sharpshooter. I think he's hitting under 30% from 3 right now. So North Carolina is definitely a team who and very sneakily now is top 20 defensively too. Have really gritted out some games recently. Duke, I think, is probably a little more volatile, but like when Duke is shooting the ball well, that's a hard team to beat because they got a bunch of guys who can beat you. Not the best defensive team, not the biggest team in the world. They beat you differently than they did last year. Rather than, starting 2 7-footers, they start 3 guards. They're very perimeter oriented, attack and transition, ball movement, et cetera, et cetera. Again, not a team you really want to get in a track meet with. Clemson, at full health, I think absolutely can be a second weekend team. I think Wake Forest is interesting with their offense, just the ability to score. Like they're probably going to play tournament games in the 80s, but they have the potential to play tournament games. Um, Miami is interesting because I think they have upset potential. And again, like what they do offensively, not a lot of teams do. They love that small ball. And Nigel Pack has been in and out of the lineup this year, but when he's in, they look pretty good. That Kentucky loss notwithstanding, I think Miami has looked solid this year, not as solid, but again, like Wake Forest, Miami, those are the teams that are like, all right, if they get in, they could score a lot of points, which can be dangerous. But outside of Duke and North Carolina, and especially North Carolina, who I think will probably be the torchbearer for the league in the NCAA tournament, I struggle to see a lot of teams that are going to make noise. Clemson second weekend, yeah, but like Virginia does not look good. Virginia, it looks like it's facing an uphill battle to make the tournament. Syracuse is still kind of in the conversation. Virginia Tech, NC State, but none of those teams are teams that if you have them as a first round matchup, you're very afraid of, to put it that way.
You mentioned the Duke team, obviously not wanting to get into a track meet with them. That was kind of the front and back of Syracuse's matchup with them back on the first half, in the low 30s, 20s, and then all of a sudden Duke comes out and makes 9 threes in the second half. Just looking at that performance, it was a tale of two halves, like I mentioned. Was anything surprising to you from the Orange's standpoint, and what kind of does that result and kind of the first half versus the second half tell you about a Syracuse team going against Duke at Cameron Indoor?
Yeah, I was really impressed with Syracuse in the first half. I really was. That was a team that I think in past years, if Duke had gotten up, 5 or 6, which it did a couple of times in that first half, I don't know that this is a team that necessarily had the horsepower to get back into it. And they did in the first half. We're rebounding well, playing pretty solid defense, forcing Duke into tough shots. And then in the second half, you saw what Duke can be. Duke had a 5-minute stretch. It was like a 16-4 run, and the game went from being 1 point to being 13 points. And like, that's it. And, to me, I just don't know that Syracuse is going to be able to make any sort of serious run with the shooting it has right now, or lack thereof. Like, if you're playing a team like Duke that can do that and can get hot like that, what's the counter? So like Syracuse has interesting pieces, I think, and that was Copeland was coming off of his, whatever supernova game, and I kept expecting like, all right, maybe this is going to be the possession, and it just didn't happen. JJ Starling even hit a 3, and I was like, wow, this is incredible, and it didn't matter. I think especially defensively, some of the gambling that the guards do, Judah especially, when you're gambling like that. Duke, they were able to make Duke pay in the first half, and in the second half, Duke figured out, all right, we're just going to pass it around you, and if you're still going to gamble, we're going to burn you. And so had a couple of like no look assists from Tyrese Proctor to March Mickle at the dunker spot. Like, I don't think Syracuse is a bad team. I just think it's inherently flawed and inherently has a cap on its ceiling because of its shooting. Like, if you could put Joe Girard shooting, if you could give that superpower to like one player on this team, I think it changes the calculus. But he's playing in a different orange uniform this year.
I think that's a really good way of putting it. And not only does all that not help when you're playing 6'6" Justin Taylor on 6'11" Kyle Filipowski, and he's not in foul trouble in the second half, that's also probably not going to be an effective defensive strategy for teams matching up with sticking with Duke a little bit, because I think the Blue Devils are really interesting, is kind of the way you limit them, really effective 3-point defense, or are there other ways you can slow Duke down? Because that's kind of, at halftime of that game, I was sitting there, I was like, did Syracuse just play really well, or did they get lucky that Duke didn't hit any shots? And it turned out the answer was, oh, Duke didn't hit any shots, and that's the reason it was a close game. Is that the only way Duke will lose games, is if they're not shooting well, or are there other ways you can attack the Blue Devils?
No, I think actually what Syracuse did in the first half, what they're switching was forcing Duke into so much ISO play. I think that's a way that you can really create problems for Duke, especially when they do have, they've got this glut of perimeter talent. At times, if you're able to switch on them, like those guys are going to feel there. It's like, all right, it's 5 seconds on the shot clock. It's me time, like Jeremy Roach, it's Jeremy Roach time. So that is one.
did in his first year, bring his team to the national title game. We'll see if that ends up happening. Obviously, they went to the national title game this year, a little bit of a different team, losing Caleb Love to Arizona, and then RJ Davis really stepping up as that main guard. Is this the best team that Hubert Davis has had in his time as head coach at North Carolina?
Outside of 6 weeks, his first year when they were on that magical run, yeah, absolutely, it's the best team has had. I mean, it's the best resume his team has had. You know, they've got non-conference wins against Oklahoma and Tennessee, and that Tennessee win is going to be that thing's going to age like fine wine. I mean, it looks better and better. Like UNC could not have put a game like that together last year, where they got out to this tremendous lead in the first half, and it got a little hairy in the second half. And they were able to come back and do that. Like those were the games that North Carolina lost last year, and quite frankly, the year before. But yeah, you know, especially defensively with this team to do, like Hubert Davis just has so many like versatile pieces, and he's got more depth than he's ever had. He's finally, again, he's not you know, going to lead the country in bench minutes by any points, but he's at least going 8, 9, sometimes 10 deep, and you know, really relying on guys like he started doing this thing, is falling into this routine, which has actually worked out really well, where he starts Elliot Cadeau, who's this reclassified 5-star pass first point guard, who quite frankly has not necessarily been up to snuff of late. And he's picked up, Elliot's been in foul trouble a couple of games, and UNC is bringing in Seth Trimble, who is one of their better defenders, and he's looked fantastic and has been a key to them turning into a top 20 defense over the last couple of weeks. So between that, you know, you've got Harrison Ingram, who can, you know, guard threes, can guard fours, can guard some fives. You know, RJ Davis is operating at a crazy usage rate, but he's also been crazy efficient. Like there's just a lot to like about this team. And again, it's not perfect. They can get beat on the boards. Armando Bacot, if he's ineffective, like, you know, or if he gets in foul trouble, they really struggle. They don't necessarily have a true backup five, especially defensively, but there's a lot to like about this team, and especially what we've seen defensively the last week and a half. I've been, you know, really impressed with what North Carolina has showed.
Yeah, thinking about that Tennessee team, I was lucky enough to be at the Maui Invitational. Syracuse played Tennessee in the opening game. And I mean, we've talked about how Syracuse struggles to score and struggles to shoot, but like seeing Tennessee up close, like that is a very good defense. Syracuse scored, I want to say mid 50s against the Vols. And then I got home and I turned on the ACC SEC challenge. North Carolina is in the 90s against Tennessee. Is this an indictment on Syracuse, or is this, you know, North Carolina playing really, really well?
Yeah, no, I think it was a couple of things. Like that's not an indictment on Syracuse, because Tennessee's defense is that good, and I think they're second right now in adjusted defensive efficiency, excuse me, per KenPom. You know, they're smothering, and they're not quite as physical as last year. You know, when they had Plavsic inside, who was just like a 7'2" brick wall of a human. They don't necessarily have that guy anymore, but they're just much more well-rounded, and like I think that game was North Carolina at its absolute best. Just absolutely lighting it up on the scoreboard. Everybody was doing what they needed to. Elliot Cadeau had 10 assists that game. Was probably his best game in the UNC jersey so far. And you had everybody scoring. It was very balanced. The other thing was Tennessee has gotten significantly better since then. You know, Zakai Ziegler, who I think you could have argued might have been the National Defensive Player of the Year last year had he not torn his ACL. He only in the last couple of weeks has started to look like that guy again, and was definitely not that guy against North Carolina. You know, Santiago Vescovi, who's one of, you know, Tennessee's veterans. You know, he's been there forever. Dependable 3-point shooter, like can play both guard positions. He was an absolute disaster in that game. It was basically Dalton Connect versus everybody. Like you know, that is the tape that NBA scouts are going to pull up when they want to see Dalton Connect. So like, I think it was a wild confluence of factors, but if you are a Syracuse fan, I don't think that struggling to score on Tennessee should be too much of an indictment. Like, again, not to oversimplify things, but when you have the fundamental lack of shooting that Syracuse has this year, it's not just the fundamental lack of shooting. It's also like, you know, they do have Naheem. It's good that they have Naheem. They haven't had a guy like him the past couple of years, but this is not a team that like thrives on the interior by any means. And so like when you're talking about not having either of those two tent poles, it's kind of hard to build something that's got real high end potential. So the fact that they haven't had any of those sort of like what happened here losses yet, I think is really encouraging. I also think that Autry is managing a lot of personalities right now. Not necessarily good personalities all the time. And so like if I'm a Syracuse fan, I'm encouraged by what I've seen so far, just thinking about it from a long-term lens, even understanding the limitations on the current team, if that makes sense.
You're talking about Tennessee. That was pretty much the first game for Syracuse of like a test of what this team could be. Their first really big competition in the Maui Invitational. You talk about the Tennessee win for North Carolina aging like fine wine. That it seems to be the case for Syracuse's win against Oregon now that they've gone on a little bit of a run, kind of aging like fine wine, potentially turning into a quad one victory. That's kind of one of the stories of North Carolina's non-conference, a very kind of difficult non-con, three ranked wins, two ranked losses, and also playing a Villanova team in there. Kind of what did North Carolina do in the non-con? How would you evaluate that, and how is that going to help them kind of down the stretch through ACC play and into the NCAA tournament?
Yeah, I think the non-conference for North Carolina is really kind of the reason you're seeing the defensive turnaround that you're seeing now, because North Carolina couldn't stop you and I in the non-conference. Eric Dixon for Villanova had a career high. Tremont Mark for Arkansas, career night. Dalton Connect, career night. Like every single team they were playing was having a dude who was like, "Oh my God, it's Christmas! Like this is the best matchup I've ever had." And quite frankly, that's kind of been the story of North Carolina since Hubert Davis became head coach. Again, outside of that 6 week stretch, like this is the team that has gotten bullied defensively in the non-conference every single year. And so when you saw that against Villanova, it was like, all right, here we go again. And then even though they're able to win against Arkansas, you're like kind of worried. Same thing with Tennessee. Like they let Tennessee come back in that game. Like the win holds, but they let Tennessee come back. And so what you're seeing now, especially, they lose the tough one to UConn. Cam Spencer lights them up. You know, basically everybody for Kentucky couldn't miss when they played Kentucky. I think because of all of those performances, what you've seen now this last week and a half is North Carolina hasn't played perfect offense. That has been the calling card under Hubert Davis. And on the road at Pitt, on the road at Clemson, these last two wins, they have not played excellent offensive basketball, and yet they have specifically shut down the people they needed to shut down, Blake Hinson and PJ Hall. And Joe Girard didn't have a great game, the other night either. So I think I don't know if that's a psychological thing where it's, hey, we are just not going to allow this anymore. I do think that as the year goes on, Hubert Davis has done some different things defensively, especially in ball screen coverages. He did some at the start of the year, then they got a little stale. He's gone back to a little more variety lately. But North Carolina's defense these past couple of weeks, I think, what they experienced in the non-conference, that was kind of the straw. And eventually it broke North Carolina's back. And now you're seeing, for the first time under Hubert Davis, a real spine from North Carolina defensively.
Yeah, I caught a little of both the Pittsburgh game and the Clemson game, and I was like, oh, this like these. I mean, I just watched Pittsburgh, score a good amount of points against Syracuse, and then North Carolina, on the road is putting the clamps on Blake Hinson, who didn't have a good game against Syracuse too. But like I just checked KenPom, they're up to 16th in defensive efficiency on KenPom. Just talked about Syracuse's ability not or inability to shoot the ball, especially what kind of challenges will Carolina present for them specifically on that end of the or I guess on both ends of the floor, but specifically Syracuse's offense versus Carolina's improved defense, because that seems like a pretty big mismatch at the moment.
Yeah, and I don't think that Syracuse's guards, who at times have a propensity for turning the ball over, I don't know that that's necessarily going to fare super well for the Orange. And again, it's kind of a similar situation to the Duke game in that, like, the two things that North Carolina can really burn you with, and the two things that it's used to overcome, the better teams that it's beaten this year are it's shot the light out from three. So, you've got Cormac Ryan can have a heater any given night. RJ Davis can have a heater. Harrison Ingram can have a heater. Seth Trimble has really evolved into a decent shooter now. Jalen Washington, like they have guys who can hurt you from the perimeter. If any one of them gets going, like, see ya. And then also, Armando Bacot has kind of gotten lost in the shuffle in terms of like National Player of the Year honors, like ACC Player of the Year honors. Like he hasn't been up to that standard, I think, from that we saw from him 2 seasons ago. But like he just shut down PJ Hall, and he's a better rebounder, I think, than anybody who Syracuse has. which is not like some sort of like huge surprise statement. Armando Bacot has the ability to dominate that game on the interior. North Carolina has the ability to dominate from the perimeter too. I do think that Syracuse, if they're able to switch effectively against North Carolina, I think that can be something that slows UNC down a little bit. But also the fact that this game is at home, I think you just are talking about a lot of factors piling up in North Carolina's favor. And like, again, if it gets to be a game where UNC, which has happened a lot this season, they run out to a 12-point lead or a 10-point lead. They did that against Oklahoma. I don't know that Syracuse is going to be a team who can shoot their way back into it. So again, not saying it can't happen. I think if Syracuse can switch effectively, they can keep this thing close. But if North Carolina is able to get any sort of mountable lead at home, I don't know that Syracuse has the horses, especially in that environment, to make a comeback.
It was funny. You mentioned the career highs for the players earlier this year. It reminded me of 2 years ago in the Dean Dome, Cole Swider going off for 36 in the overtime game. I was going to ask how realistic do you think is Syracuse's chances? But you kind of just touched on a little bit there. What does Syracuse kind of have to do to exploit UNC to have a chance like they did against Duke going into the second half to have a chance to pull off the upset?
Yeah, well, Syracuse, I think the games that Syracuse has won this year, they've done a really nice job of turning teams over, and using that as a way to create offense. And so on a North Carolina team that does have multiple ball handlers like that, I think the switching will be huge, blowing up some of the sets that North Carolina wants to run. And again, this is a UNC team that can dominate in terms of rebounding when Armando Bacot's at his best, but it does not always. And so, especially if you can get him into some early foul trouble, it's an interior that's up for the grabs. I mean, Jalen Washington is UNC's backup five and a really skilled offensive player, but defensively just has no strength. Like that is a matchup that Syracuse absolutely can take advantage of. So, if you like, I think that Judah is quick enough to keep up with RJ Davis. That's not something you can say about every lead guard in the league. But is he going to be interested in actually staying with him, or is he going to be swiping for steals? So it's like a fine line because you have to be able to do both. So turning North Carolina over is something not a lot of teams have had success with this year. Oklahoma is another team who, traditionally has done that really well this year and didn't against UNC. So I think if you can switch defensively, get Armando Bacot in foul trouble, try and take advantage of some second chance points. North Carolina has been vulnerable there at times this season. Like there is a pathway to success. There's just a much larger pathway to success for North Carolina. Like there is not a lot of leeway here for Syracuse.
Yeah, the margin for error is much greater for North Carolina. We'll see if the Orange have what it takes. First of two meetings, a month apart exactly. And Syracuse gets Carolina at home on a Tuesday night in February, I'm guessing since they played Duke on the road, they played Georgetown on the road. That'll probably be the biggest home game of the year for Syracuse. And its biggest chance for a signature win in front of its home fans. It'll be a really interesting game in February, but this Saturday's game a lot more pertinent and will be the eye. I know Duke was close to, I think they were around a 15-point favorite last week. I would expect North Carolina to be something in that same realm. Brendan, thank you so much for joining us. Where can people, find your work and coverage of Saturday's game?
Yeah, absolutely. All my stories go up at The Athletic, theathletic.com. If you haven't checked this out so far, I'm biased, but I think we have the most comprehensive sports writing in the world. You get all my stuff, you get the rest of our college basketball team, but you also get NFL, NBA, NHL, MLB. And I also, I put all my stuff on my Twitter at Brendan R. Marks, or X, if we're calling it that now. But yeah, very excited for Saturday. It should be a good one.
Really, really appreciate your time and thanks for joining us once again.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. I'm looking forward to doing it again next year, 4 years in a row.